Good afternoon. My name is Owen McCawley. I work at the U.S. Army Center for Army Lesson Learn. We're known as CALL. That's our shortening. Today, you've seen numerous Army or DOD or Air Force agencies from the U.S. here. A lot of them do lessons learned. We overlap a little, and what we do, I want to point out to our partners here, is we actually do talk to each other. We have once a year, the U.S. Army has a lessons collection synchronization conference, and that's where we get all the different Army and even other services come to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and we exchange ideas and we build a plan to collect for the next year. So we get guidance from our higher headquarters, we get guidance from the field, and then we put this plan together and we sync and we look for efficiencies so we could go out and collect these lessons learned, and then when we come back to share them. But today what I'm going to talk about is humanitarian assistance operations for the U.S., specifically for the U.S. Army. And basically, it's a very complex operation, and that's one of the reasons we picked it, because you definitely are operating in a multi-domain, multi-agency domain. Part of the thing I'm going to talk about today is how do we get these lessons learned out to the force. And I'll show you in the first part of our briefing here is what CALL does and how we get these lessons out there, because we don't want to just stick them in that database. We want to get them out there and make them actionable. So this is an agenda real quick, and the reason we picked the Haitian earthquake, Katrina, and Philippines, because for the U.S. Army, they're very distinct, different operations and support. So Haiti was pretty close to us, was in our backyard. Katrina was in our front yard, and then the Philippines was a little far away. So the thing about the Philippine typhoon, the U.S. Army was in a support role. It was run by the Marine Corps. That one, the U.S. Army had a little less operational support in it, but it was very key. And when I get to that briefing, I'll point out why that was key. So here at CALL, the Center for Army Lessons Learned, this is our mission. I could boil it down to that we're scouts for the Army. We've been around since 1985. So there was a cone of lessons learned. And if you look at that cone, it was done individually by units and for wars. And nobody up through the 60s really kept those lessons learned in a central depository. And when we went into Grenada, and it was kind of we had a lot of mistakes in Grenada, but the one thing the generals were just fed up, and they said, let's collect the lessons, learn, and put them in one place for the Army. So they established CALL in 1985, and that all was part of, we set up our national training centers. So there was this whole idea of getting into a learning institution, and that included the training, the doctrine, and the lessons learned all being under the same folks. This here just basically shows how we do our, how the cycle works. Well, the first part of the cycle is this pamphlet on the top left of the slide, and that's a regulation. The Army actually has a regulation that says units will do lessons learned. The problem with that, there's about 400 other regulations out there. So what does a poor commander do? Does he, which one does he do well? Which ones does he do the best? So we have the regulation. It tells them after every operation or exercise, they have to send us their lessons learned. Well, we actually, because only about 15% of the units actually do that, we have two guys who their full-time job is to reach out, track exercises, and pull that information from these guys. So basically, the basic cycle for us is we collect, we analyze, disseminate, and then resolve. The key point is resolve. The way we do that is we actually have a forum called the Army Lesson Learned Forum. It's run by a 3-star general. And this 3-star general, by having him in charge of your forum, brings all those stakeholders to us. So we have all the different agencies listed there, the capability guys, the development, the doctrines, the infantry, artillery, all those guys meet about once a quarter, and we bring up the issues and the lessons and the gaps that we've seen the last quarter. The importance of this is the 3-star general pins the rose on somebody to fix the lesson. And that's the very important part, because years ago, we were the ones told to fix the lessons. we have a 06 or a colonel in charge, and there's only so much power that that guy has. So how do we do this? How do we make the system work? It's a push-pull system. So what we do is we track their exercises and operations, and we push lessons learned to them from the last one. So we're sitting there watching the TV, and we see a hurricane's coming down somewhere, and we'll push all our lessons learned on hurricanes to our units. There's a lot of exercises or a lot of operations in the United States that aren't even reported. The National Guard goes out for almost every little tornado we have or flood or things along those lines. Well, the National Guard, they always do their lessons learned too. We collect that stuff up too. So our database is actually pretty big. So like I said, we push the lessons to them. And when you push something to somebody and you help them out a little bit, we contact them. And when they're done with their operation, we ask them for their lessons, and usually we get it pretty easily. A lot of guys want to share their information. So another thing we do on exercises is we actually get involved in the planning cycle. We can't do that on all the exercises, but we go to the planning conferences, get our face there. So for instance, there's an exercise coming up, Talisman Sabre in Australia. We've already been to 2 meetings with the planners on that exercise. And that also, you bring in those planners who a lot of times are new guys. We're bringing them lessons learned from the last one. So you build a little credibility with those guys. We employ LNOs throughout the world. We actually have people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and different bases for the U.S. Army. And these guys do the same thing. They do push and pull. And then one of the other things we do, we actually analyze the data. So when you give a guy lesson learned, you just don't do a data dump on him. You actually analyze it and bring out the high points so these people can go ahead and make decisions based off of previous lessons learned. A couple of things we do to reach out to our force. We have a monthly email, has 197,000 people on it. We put out the new lessons learned that we that we have from that month, the new products. And then we have a website. So part of it, the whole lesson learned stuff is StratCom. So today, what I really want to talk about is the lessons learned that we have from humanitarian assistance operations. And the humanitarian assistance operations, for us, it's the challenge of our world. We talked about this earlier, how the world's population is growing. Most of it's in developing country, and most of it's in exposed areas where you do have some of these humanitarian assistance, these disasters, these type of operations going on. Recently, we had a conversation with our Pacific Command, and they anticipate that over 50% of their deployable operations will be in some sort of humanitarian assistance operation. So they're preparing for that. They're doing things like staging some equipment in different countries, generators, tents, water purification equipment. So they're pre-staging that stuff around the world so that we could get to it fast, and it cuts the line of communications. And then this is a snapshot of disasters and incidents that happened a couple years ago. And as you can see, every part of the world is hit. Specifically, a lot of it's in the Pacific area. But you can see that being that the United States is a global force, we go to a lot of these different areas and try and help out. And they're all different, unique areas. You could be in a hurricane, you could be in typhoon, then you could go to an earthquake. And we even got guys fighting forest fires in the U.S. So what does the military bring to the table? Well, we bring the organizations, an organized force, but probably really most important is the transportation capabilities, those helicopters. If you look at the National Guard, in the United States, we have 54, I think, National Guards. The number one thing a National Guard governor or National Guard commander plus the governor wants is helicopters. They want that lift capability because it's a very useful asset that they can have. Plus, we also have the transport planes. That's a pretty good thing to bring to the table. It helps out a lot. Communications, we bring pretty good communication suites, and then we bring that logistic and supply tail. Really, the United States, we have a lot of practice at that because in deployments, a lot of times, well, most of the time we're playing away. When we're doing operations or conflicts, it's mostly an away game. So by playing away, we had to figure out in the last 50, 60 years how to develop that logistic supply and that tail that goes with it so we can bring all our stuff to the game that's in somebody else's hometown. So here, what we have, what does the commander that's get tagged to go to a humanitarian assistance operation? And we saw this really in Haiti, real bad, and a lot of the other ones. So we call it the fog of relief. You know, this poor young lieutenant colonel, his battalion's been identified, or a colonel's been identified to go into a area, humanitarian assistance that he doesn't have much training on. Well, now you inject this military force into this very busy area where the operations are already chaotic. The central government may or may not be around. There's competition for scarce resources. There's confusion on the ground. And if you don't work together and understand all these other players in there, the beneficiary will suffer. So basically, you're working with people and organizations that you may or may not know anything about. And that's a lot of things that our commanders find out when they get on the ground if they have no previous experience in humanitarian assistance. So quickly I'm going to go through the three operations we went through and just highlight a couple areas here. I don't want to get too far off time here. So as we know, Kuwait got hit with a 7 magnitude earthquake. Bottom line there is Kuwait was probably the last country, or Haiti was the last country in the world that needed a disaster. They were already not a functioning place. So they lost 230,000 people. The point is, for us, the U.S., it was our largest overseas deployment for humanitarian operations. We sent 22,000 troops, 58 aircraft, and 23 ships. So what we quickly had to do is understand what's going on. Now, you have an earthquake in a country that already has some problems, and then it hits the capital city, which adds to the problem. So we just had to get a grasp on what's happening. And this map just shows where all the people went, you know, accountability, and how do we now feed those people that left the city. Here is what you ran into. Kuwaiti also, like I said before, had some issues. Now you add some more issues to it, and this is what we were working with on the post-earthquake. So the commander shows up, this is what he's working with. He doesn't even have docks available. So going into Haiti, this was the U.S. commander's intent. And basically, really, he wanted to deploy rapidly and get in there to save lives. There's a hell of a lot of people that were trapped in the buildings and stuff. And one of the issues that came up, we were sending in water and food. What we really should have been sending is rescue teams for the first 3 days at least. And develop that understanding of what's going on, speed of delivery, and establish command and control. We also went in very heavy with security, which it turned out we really didn't need. There was not so much looting that we thought was going to happen. And then enable mobility. A lot of the streets, they didn't have trucks. A lot of the stuff was damaged, so we had to clear the streets to get stuff around. And here's some of the lessons that we learned there, real quick. Build partnerships. We really learned a lot about working with the NGOs there. We established our own websites. A lot of this stuff, we switched from our tactical networks to radios, Motorola radios, so we could talk to different people. We set up the CMOC. We had invited people to come to it. And one of the problems was a lot of times some of these NGOs didn't want to tell us what was going on. So we actually went on their website to see what they were reporting back to their donors to get a grasp of where they're at and what they're doing. And then Hurricane Katrina, that was the costliest national disaster in the United States. We lost over 1,800 people, and it basically destroyed a major U.S. city. So one of the problems with Katrina, as you can see the track of the hurricane, is a lot of the forces that were coming down to help out were in that track. So we had to quickly switch and get forces from the Midwest, notify those National Guard guys, and get them coming down that way. This was the U.S. commander's intent, and the highlighted yellow was actually the Army staff. These guys are sitting in Washington, D.C. That was what he was given. And then his actual commander's priorities are there. Those were what he changed once he got on the ground. His primary thing, besides search and rescue, was fixing the airport. because if he didn't have the airport, he couldn't get all the supplies in, and that was number one. And then evacuation for the people that were clustered in the Superdome that we had down there. So some of the lessons here is validating the missions. We had everybody telling us, the National Guard guys, the state governors, because this thing crossed multi-jurisdictions from counties to states to cities, asking the Army to do something and the National Guard to do something. So how do you validate those missions? And that was one of the biggest problems we had, is to figure out a system to validate the missions. Liaison officers were very, very useful in all of these operations. And that typhoon. Now, a lot of you guys may have worked with the typhoon. Well, it was Philippines, November 2013, and there was about 6,000 people that were lost there. The point I want to make with the Army's participation on this typhoon was that we stood up a crisis action center, and we're part of the U.S. military's crisis action center. And most importantly, we supported, we didn't go in there and do anything without the Philippine government's request for assistance. Unlike Haiti, where the government pretty much collapsed, in the Philippines, they still had a working government that we, through the USAID, fulfilled the request. One thing in a big lesson for the Army that came out of Philippine Typhoon was that the U.S. Army has this foreign area officers. They're throughout the world. We have officers that actually speak the language, work in the country. We use those guys in the Philippines, and they were a great asset because we actually sent them from the embassy or where they were at, training troops, to go look and scout out areas where we can bring forces in and or areas that need our help. And then being that they're in the country, know the people, we were able to get a better assessment of what's going on. And then financials matter. That's one thing. After all these operations, somebody has to do the checkbook. So do it while you're in process. So what do we do at the Lesson Learned Center? The Army Lesson Learned Center, we put out reports on all these operations. We put out pamphlets, we put out handbooks, and what we do with them is we look for that common thread, that interoperability common thread, and then we'll do a bigger study and share that stuff with everybody. So these are a couple of the handbooks and reports that we have on these operations. And then what we do, is we put this stuff on our websites and we share it with the Army, plus our database. That was about a 40-minute briefing in about 20 minutes there. I'm sorry I didn't go into too much details, but we're around. We have the website. We have all this information, and we just want to let you know that we're willing to share this stuff with you guys. We work with our counterparts in the other Army agencies, and we work with a lot of your Lessons Learned Center sharing and learning from each other. Thank you.